The rotting corpse stood in the doorway of York Cathedral, its flesh sliding off its bones like melted wax. Archbishop Thurston froze, his holy water trembling in his hands, as the thing that had once been Lord William de Montfort took another lurching step forward. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The dead were meant to stay dead. But here in the year 1137, in the heart of Christian England, a nightmare straight from hell was unfolding. Within weeks, this single incident would spiral into a panic that would consume half of England, leaving thousands dead. Not from the walking corpses themselves, but from the terrified living, who would burn entire villages to stop them. And it all started because King Stephen of England, in his desperate bid to hold on to power during the bloodiest civil war in English history, made one catastrophic decision. He gave the church permission to deal with the unquiet dead by any means necessary. Those 7 words would unleash a horror that would make the Black Death look merciful by comparison. Because when you tell medieval peasants that zombies are real and give them religious authority to kill anyone suspicious, what follows isn't justice, it's madness. The records from that time are clear. Respected chroniclers, bishops and abbots all reported the same thing. The dead were walking, and England was under siege from its own corpses. But the real terror wasn't in the graveyards, it was in what the living would do when fear replaced reason, when neighbour turned on neighbour, when entire communities descended into paranoid bloodshed. This is the story they don't teach you in history class. How medieval England experienced its own zombie apocalypse, and how one weak king's attempt to maintain control accidentally triggered a genocide that would haunt the nation for generations. The nightmare began not with a bite or a virus, but with a single piece of parchment sealed with royal wax that would transform local superstition into licensed slaughter. The parchment arrived at Westminster on a cold February morning, carried by a messenger whose horse was near death from exhaustion. King Stephen barely looked up from his maps of rebel positions. England was tearing itself apart in the civil war they'd later call the Anarchy, with his cousin Empress Matilda claiming the throne was rightfully hers. Half his barons had already switched sides, and now York was sending him tales of walking corpses. He almost threw the letter into the fire. But Archbishop Thurston wasn't known for flights of fancy. The man who crowned him king was as practical as they came, a political operator who understood that maintaining order meant more than prayers and sermons. If Thurston was writing about the dead walking, something real was happening in the north. The letter was specific, clinical even in its horror. 3 weeks prior, William de Montfort, a minor lord known for his cruelty and corruption, had died under suspicious circumstances, found at the bottom of his own castle stairs, with his neck twisted at an impossible angle. Most assumed his long-suffering wife had finally had enough. The local priest, Father Benedict, had refused to bury him in consecrated ground, declaring that a man who'd stolen churchlands and terrorised monasteries deserved no Christian burial. So they dumped him in a shallow grave by the crossroads, the traditional spot for suicides and criminals. That should have been the end of William de Montfort. It wasn't. The first sighting came 5 days after the burial. A shepherd swore he saw Lord William stumbling through his flock at dusk, his head lolling at that same unnatural angle. The sheep had scattered in terror, and several were found the next morning with their throats torn out. The shepherd's story might have been dismissed as wine-soaked fantasy, except the next night, William appeared at his own castle. His widow's screams woke the entire household as her dead husband stood at the foot of their bed, flesh already beginning to rot, reaching for her with hands that dripped grave dirt. By morning she was mad with terror, babbling about his cold touch and the smell of putrefaction that lingered in the chamber. Within a week, the walking corpse of William de Montfort had been seen by dozens of witnesses. He wandered the streets of York at night, peering into windows, scratching at doors. Where he walked, sickness followed. A strange fever began spreading through the city, killing the weak and elderly with frightening speed. The connection seemed obvious. The unquiet dead brought pestilence with them. Archbishop Thurston tried conventional methods first. He ordered the grave dug up and the body properly buried with full Christian rites, hoping this would quiet the restless spirit. But when they opened the crude grave by the crossroads, they found it empty. Only a foul-smelling black liquid remained, as if the body had melted away. That night William de Montfort was seen again, now missing chunks of flesh, his noble clothes hanging in tatters from his decomposing frame. Panic began to spread faster than the fever. Other stories started surfacing. A merchant in Beverley, whose corpse had been seen walking the city walls. A nun in Whitby, who died of plague but was spotted wandering the moors at night. What had seemed like isolated incidents suddenly felt like a pattern. The dead were rising across Yorkshire, and nobody knew why. Some blamed witchcraft, others saw it as divine punishment for England's sins during the Civil War. But everyone agreed on one thing. Something had to be done before the walking dead outnumbered the living. Archbishop Thurston, desperate to maintain order, had written to the king not just to inform him of the crisis, but to ask for unprecedented powers. He wanted royal authority to take any action necessary to stop the plague of revenants. It was a dangerous request that blurred the lines between church and crown authority. But these were desperate times. King Stephen, distracted and desperately needing the church's support against Empress Matilda, made a decision that would echo through centuries. He granted Archbishop Thurston and all church authorities in England the power to deal with the unquiet dead by any means necessary, including the examination, exhumation, and destruction of suspected revenants, and the investigation of any persons who might be causing such unholy resurrections through witchcraft or diabolic practices. The king probably thought he was authorising some grave robberies and maybe a few bonfires. He had no idea he'd just signed a death warrant for thousands of innocent people. The royal decree spread across England faster than any plague. Within days of leaving Westminster, copies were being read from pulpits across the kingdom. Local priests, many barely literate themselves, interpreted the king's words with enthusiasm that bordered on zealotry. If the dead were walking, then surely someone was making them walk. If bodies could leave their graves, then Satan's servants must be among them. The hunt for revenants quickly became a hunt for anyone who might be different, strange, or simply unpopular. And in the chaos of civil war, with lawful authority already breaking down, the king's decree became a license for madness. The first documented massacre happened in the village of Bramham, just outside York. A local woman named Marjorie Brewster had been seen gathering herbs in the cemetery at night, a common practice for healers who believed plants growing near graves had special properties. But in the fevered atmosphere following the king's decree, her midnight herb gathering became evidence of necromancy. The village priest, Father Hugh, declared from his pulpit that Marjorie was raising the dead with her witch's brew. A mob gathered outside her cottage that very afternoon. What happened next was recorded by a travelling monk who witnessed the horror. The crowd, led by Father Hugh himself, dragged Marjorie from her home along with her two daughters, aged 12 and 14. They were accused of being a coven of witches responsible for the walking dead. No trial was held. The king's decree gave the church authority to act by any means necessary, and Father Hugh interpreted this as divine permission for immediate justice. All three women were burned alive in the village square, their screams echoing across the countryside. But the horror didn't end there. As the flames consumed them, several villagers claimed to see shapes moving in the smoke. The spirits of the dead that the witches had raised finally being released. This confirmation of guilt sent the mob into a greater frenzy. They turned on Marjorie's neighbours, then on anyone who'd ever bought herbs from her, then on anyone who tried to defend the accused. By nightfall, 17 people were dead, their bodies thrown onto the growing pyre. The Bramham massacre set a terrifying precedent. Across Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, similar scenes began playing out. In some villages, it was the cunning women and healers who were targeted first. In others, it was outsiders, travelling merchants, wandering friars, anyone who couldn't prove deep local roots. The criteria for suspicion grew broader by the day. Did you keep strange hours? You might be meeting with the dead. Did you have unusual marks on your body? Clearly the devil's sign. Did you prosper while your neighbours suffered? Obviously you'd made a pact with evil forces. The king's decree had transformed every petty jealousy and old grudge into a potential death sentence. Meanwhile, reports of actual revenants continued to pour in. William of Newburgh, one of the most respected chroniclers of the age, documented dozens of cases with disturbing consistency. In Berwick, a dead merchant was seen by multiple witnesses walking through the town, leaving footprints in fresh mud. When brave men tracked the footprints back to his grave, they found the earth disturbed from below, as if something had clawed its way out. In Melrose Abbey, a monk who died in sin reportedly returned to assault his fellow brothers at night, leaving them with scratches and bite marks that festered and wouldn't heal. Each new sighting fueled the panic, and each panic led to more violence against the living. The church, rather than trying to calm the situation, seemed to embrace it. Bishops across England issued guidelines for identifying revenants and those who might create them. Bodies that didn't decay properly were suspect. Blood around the mouth or nose of a corpse indicated it had been feeding on the living. Fingernails or hair that appeared to have grown after death proved the body was still somehow alive. These signs led to mass exhumations, with terrified villagers digging up recent burials to check for evidence of revenancy. When they inevitably found bodies in various states of decomposition, which they didn't understand was completely normal, they saw confirmation of their worst fears. The response was always the same. Burn the body, burn anyone who might have caused it to rise, burn anything that might be contaminated by its presence. By the summer of 1137, what had started as isolated incidents in Yorkshire had spread across half of England. The Civil War, which had already created a breakdown in law and order, provided the perfect breeding ground for mass hysteria. In areas controlled by King Stephen, the royal decree gave legitimacy to the violence. In areas held by Empress Matilda, the panic spread anyway, as refugees fleeing the revenant plague brought their fears with them. Conservative estimates suggest that by autumn, at least 3,000 people had been killed. Not by walking corpses, but by their terrified neighbours acting on suspicion and superstition. Entire villages were abandoned as communities turned on themselves. Fields went unharvested as farmers huddled in churches, afraid to venture out after dark. Trade routes shut down as merchants refused to travel through infected areas. England wasn't just fighting a civil war anymore. It was devouring itself from within, consumed by a fear that King Stephen's careless decree had transformed from local folklore into a national catastrophe. And still the reports of Walking Dead continued. The man who would change everything arrived in York on a rain-soaked October morning, his black robes marking him as a Cistercian monk. Brother Thomas of Rievaulx Abbey had been sent by his abbot to investigate the growing chaos, but what he found exceeded his worst expectations. The city streets were nearly empty, windows shuttered against more than just the autumn rain. Funeral pyres burned continuously outside the city walls, fed by a steady stream of bodies, some freshly dead from the mysterious fever, others exhumed from graveyards on suspicion of revenancy, and too many who'd been executed as witches or necromancers. The stench of burning flesh had become so common that residents barely noticed it anymore. But Brother Thomas noticed. He noticed everything. At the cathedral, he found Archbishop Thurston in a state near collapse. The man who'd once been a powerful political figure was now gaunt and hollow-eyed, overwhelmed by the monster he'd helped create. Petitioners lined up outside his chambers day and night, some begging for protection from the Walking Dead, others demanding action against suspected witches, still others pleading for the lives of accused relatives. The Archbishop had requested the king's help to restore order, but instead had unleashed a horror that made the original problem seem trivial by comparison. When Brother Thomas asked to see the records of revenant sightings, Thurston laughed bitterly. "Which ones?" he asked. "The real sightings or the thousands of reports we receive daily? Every shadow is now a walking corpse, every illness proof of their corruption, every death suspicious." But Brother Thomas was not easily discouraged. A learned man who'd studied in Paris before taking his vows, he approached the crisis with the methodical mind of a scholar. He began by examining the original reports, the ones that had started the panic. What he found made him frown in concentration. The sightings followed patterns. They clustered around certain areas, happened at specific times, and the descriptions, when stripped of hysteria and embellishment, were remarkably consistent. Either Yorkshire truly was experiencing an unprecedented outbreak of the Walking Dead, or something else was happening. Something that mundane minds, gripped by fear and superstition, were interpreting as supernatural. His investigation led him to a disturbing discovery. Many of the earliest revenant sightings had occurred near monasteries and religious houses that had been dissolved or abandoned during the Civil War, places where desperate people might take shelter, places where someone suffering from disease or injury might seek sanctuary. Brother Thomas began to suspect that at least some of the Walking Dead might have been very much alive, plague victims, lepers, or simply vagrants whose appearance was so wretched that terrified witnesses assumed they must be corpses. But by the time he'd reached this conclusion, The original revenants had long since been hunted down and burned. Dead men tell no tales, especially when they've been reduced to ash. Still, Brother Thomas pressed on with his investigation. He interviewed witnesses, examined supposed bite marks and scratches, even convinced authorities to let him observe several exhumations. What he found was a mixture of natural decomposition, misunderstood by ignorant peasants, deliberate fraud by those seeking to settle old scores, and a few genuinely puzzling cases that defied easy explanation. But most disturbing of all was what he discovered about the fever that accompanied the revenant sightings. Through careful questioning of survivors, he identified symptoms that suggested not some supernatural plague, but a disease he'd encountered in his travels. What Mediterranean traders called grave fever or corpse poison. What later centuries would know as anthrax. The connection was horrifying in its simplicity. The Civil War had left countless bodies hastily buried in shallow graves. The wet summer had caused flooding across Yorkshire, washing decomposing remains into water supplies. Animals grazing near these impromptu graveyards contracted the disease first, then passed it to humans through meat and milk. The revenant plague was real, but it had nothing to do with the walking dead and everything to do with contaminated corpses poisoning the living. But who would believe a simple monk when the alternative explanation, that the dead walked and witches commanded them, was so much more compelling to minds steeped in fear? Brother Thomas tried to present his findings to Archbishop Thurston, but the political situation had spiralled beyond mere truth. Local lords were using the revenant panic to settle disputes, seizing lands from accused families. The church was growing rich from confiscated properties of executed witches. Even King Stephen, still fighting his civil war, found the crisis useful. Areas gripped by revenant panic were too busy burning their neighbours to join Empress Matilda's rebellion. The truth had become inconvenient to everyone in power. When Brother Thomas persisted, insisting that they were killing innocent people based on superstition and misunderstanding, he was quietly warned that his own investigations were beginning to look suspicious. After all, why would someone defend witches unless they were in league with them? The breaking point came on All Hallows' Eve, 1137. In the village of Clifford, near York, the entire population had gathered in the church, terrified by reports that an army of revenants was approaching. The reports weren't entirely false. Brother Thomas, continuing his investigation despite warnings, had discovered a group of plague victims sheltering in an abandoned barn nearby, driven from their homes by the disease, covered in the black boils that marked the late stages of infection. They'd banded together for mutual protection. In the darkness, glimpsed from a distance by terrified villagers, they might indeed have looked like walking corpses, but they were alive, suffering, and about to become victims of the greatest atrocity yet. The village priest, Father William, had worked his congregation into a frenzy with a sermon about the final battle between good and evil. When scouts reported movement in the woods nearby, he declared it was the moment of judgment. Armed with torches, farm implements, and righteous fury, the entire village marched out to meet the army of the dead. What followed was less a battle than a massacre. The plague victims, too weak to flee or fight, were surrounded and burned alive in the barn where they'd taken shelter. Men, women, children. At least 40 souls perished in the flames. The villagers returned to their church singing hymns of victory, convinced they'd struck a great blow against the forces of darkness. Brother Thomas arrived the next morning to find the still smouldering ruins and the charred remains within. His horror turned to rage as he realised what had happened. These weren't revenants or creatures of evil. They were victims of disease who'd been murdered by their own countrymen. He gathered what evidence he could and rode hard for York, determined to finally make someone listen. But the roads were dangerous now, filled with armed bands hunting for witches and revenants. Near the village of Askham, Brother Thomas was stopped by one such group. They demanded to know why he was travelling alone at night, why he was defending witches, why he spent so much time examining corpses. The logic of mob justice is circular. Anyone who questions the mob must be an enemy of the mob. They found his notes, his careful documentation of the real causes behind the revenant plague. To minds poisoned by fear and propaganda, it looked like the writings of a necromancer. Detailed descriptions of corpses, discussions of disease spread, questions about why the dead might appear to walk. Brother Thomas tried to explain, but explanations required reason, and reason had fled England months ago. They tied him to a tree, piled kindling at his feet, and prepared to burn him as a witch. He was saved only by the sudden arrival of a group of Templar knights, returning from the Holy Land, who scattered the mob and cut him free. But the message was clear. Even a man of God wasn't safe if he challenged the narrative that justified the killings. The Templars, hardened warriors who'd seen real horrors in the East, were disgusted by what they found in England. Their commander, Sir Roland de Vere, had expected to return to a Christian kingdom. Instead, he found a land gripped by madness, where neighbour killed neighbour, based on phantom fears. When Brother Thomas shared his findings, Sir Roland made a decision that would finally begin to turn the tide. The Templars would protect the monk and help him present his evidence to the highest authority in the land. Not King Stephen, who'd proven himself too weak and distracted to care, but to the papal legate, Cardinal Albric of Ostia, who'd recently arrived to mediate in the civil war. The journey to London, where the cardinal was staying, became a passage through hell. Every village showed signs of the terror. Empty houses marked with crosses to ward off revenants, fresh graves of executed witches, children orphaned by the panic begging in the streets. Sir Roland's warriors had to fight off several mobs who tried to attack refugees fleeing the violence. The England they travelled through was no longer the green and pleasant land of legend, but a charnel house where the living had become more monstrous than any walking corpse could ever be. Brother Thomas documented everything, building a case that would shock even a cardinal who thought he'd seen every human evil. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. In the town of Stamford, they met a man who claimed to have been one of the original revenants, a leper named Geoffrey, who'd been mistaken for the walking dead and hunted through the streets. He'd survived by hiding in the sewers, living like an animal, while the town burned others who'd shared his affliction. His testimony was heartbreaking, how illness and disfigurement transformed him from a merchant into a monster in the eyes of his neighbours, how the king's decree had turned a manageable disease into a death sentence. Here was living proof that at least some of the walking dead had simply been sick people, murdered by mass hysteria. The question now was whether anyone would listen, or whether England would continue its descent into madness. The meeting with Cardinal Albric changed everything. Faced with Brother Thomas's meticulous evidence and the testimony of survivors, the papal legate issued a decree that contradicted King Stephen's original order. The dead were not walking. There were no armies of revenants. The real plague was fear itself, and it had claimed far more victims than any disease. By Christmas of 1137, the killing had largely stopped, though the damage was irreversible. Conservative estimates put the death toll at over 4,000 souls, burned as witches, executed as necromancers, or murdered simply for being sick, strange, or different. Entire villages had been depopulated, productive farmland abandoned, communities torn apart by suspicion and betrayal that would last generations. King Stephen, when finally confronted with the consequences of his hasty decree, claimed he'd never intended such carnage, but historical records show he made no effort to stop it while it served his political purposes. The zombie panic of 1137 remains one of the darkest chapters in medieval English history, a time when fear triumphed over reason, when neighbours became executioners, when the living proved far more monstrous than any imagined walking dead. Brother Thomas spent his remaining years documenting the tragedy, ensuring that future generations would remember not the fictional revenants, but the very real victims of mass hysteria. What makes this story truly terrifying isn't the medieval setting or the superstitious beliefs, it's how familiar it feels, how quickly fear can transform ordinary people into killers, how easily authority can weaponize panic for political gain, how the most dangerous monsters are always the ones we create ourselves. If this story disturbed you, if it made you think about the power of mass hysteria and the importance of critical thinking, then perhaps some good can come from remembering this dark chapter. History has a way of repeating itself when we forget its lessons. Subscribe to hear more untold stories from history, the ones they don't teach in school because they reveal too much about human nature. The past is full of warnings. We just need to remember to listen.